It looks like we're live. Hi, everybody.
Hey, Scott.
This is Scott DeWare.
Hello.
I'll get you all in the first module in the office hours. I am one of the instructors for the class, and I am right now in Columbus, Ohio, in the United States. And I am joined here with two of the other instructors in the class. We're an instructor and a librarian. I'll let them introduce themselves.
I'm Kay Halasek. As Scott said, I'm one of the other instructors in the course, and I'm also coming to you from Columbus, Ohio, in my office on campus at Ohio State.
Hi, I'm Melissa. I'm a librarian from Columbus State Community College, and I'm also coming to you from Columbus, my beautiful apartment near Franklin Park.
Well, we have really on our agenda for today talking with you a little bit about transitioning from composing your public service announcement, which you finished earlier this week, and moving into a more research-intensive experience with your final assignment for the course before you begin stepping back and revising, which you'll be doing in Module 5. So we wanted to take actually this time this week to talk first a little bit about transitioning from the public service announcement, which has been a multimodal and I don't want to say small scale because it's critically important, but a limited sort of space or time in which you take up your research topic, whether that has to do with social identities and education and so forth, and now thinking about moving from that into the research project. And so we wanted to start really maybe a little bit with that. And I think, Scott, if you'd be willing, because you do a lot of work in multimodal composition, if you might talk a little bit either about your own experiences as a composer of multimodal texts in something like the PSA and an instructor who assigns those, and then how you talk with students or just other writers about moving toward a more heavily researched piece that might be more alphabetic but still multimodal.
I think the biggest challenge, it's a challenge for the PSA, but it also then feeds into that transition, is that clearly the PSA is concise. It doesn't mean that we haven't thought about the rhetorical concepts of audience and purpose, and we haven't thought about our sense of ethos and the arguments that we're trying to make in some serious ways. We definitely have, but that product that we've actually produced is so much more concise than what we might think of as a more researched piece of writing. And I always think that the biggest challenge when I'm working on something like the PSA, in many ways, is my ethos and the faith that I'm asking the audience to have in the PSA that I'm creating, or in this more compact text. It doesn't mean that I haven't done research, and it doesn't mean that I haven't very carefully thought about the many different complicated layers of my argument, but because of the size of the product or the length of the product, if it's a streaming product, I have to establish my sense of ethos, that authority that I have, and that connection that I'm having with the audience, the faith that they have in me. I have to do that in a much quicker way. Those texts go by very quickly, and I have a lot that I need to say in a very short amount of time. That's a huge challenge, and so I think anybody who has taken up the PSA assignment had to face that. Kay, you and I were talking about even writing short announcements for this class, of that as academics we tend to be very wordy. Like a PSA, it's very hard for us to work on because we've always had the luxury of the written text to explain ourselves, and so when you're working on the PSA, it's a huge challenge. I think that if for the people who worked on the PSA, then moving to the research project, there is in some ways a new challenge, but there's also a sense of relief a lot, is that I don't have to be as concise. I get to actually explore something, and I get to unpack some ideas in ways that I couldn't do with the PSA. And I think that the expectations from the audience change. I think that when I look at a PSA, I do have faith in the person who has created that, or the person who's trying to convey an argument to me, that they've done the work behind the scenes, that research, some of that research is there. But when I start looking at a more lengthy research project, and especially when that might be written, and it might have more either, sometimes it's for an academic audience, sometimes it's for a public audience. I'm expecting to see sources that people have consulted to be unpacked a little bit. I want to see how people have agreed and disagreed, so I want to see how some of those sources are in conversation with one another. As somebody who might be writing a research project, what becomes really interesting to me is the role that that research plays in my writing process, and in many ways it becomes much more about invention, what it is that I'm learning as a writer, and as much as it is in how I make that connection with the audience that I'm addressing in my project.
So there.
Oh, it's okay.
Oh, sorry. So what I want to, at the risk of sort of stepping back and summarizing what you've just said, I want to kind of pull out what I see as some really useful distinctions, just to highlight them a little bit. And the one you use the word or the adjective distilled to talk about the PSA. And so I'm thinking, so where the PSA is more distilled, the research project is more sustained. Now, I realize that's kind of a mixed metaphor, but it's distilled and then more sustained. And so rather than sort of having to distill an argument and present it in a very concise format, what a research project is going to do is it's going to have to identify, name, and then sustain an argument. And a lot of what happens in the PSA, as you said, that's behind the scenes, actually comes on stage, right? In the research project itself. It's no longer behind the scenes, but is actually part of the action of what is on stage, what's actually happening in the research project. And that's where that unpacking and conversation comes into play, which you had also mentioned. So those are really useful sort of distinctions for me as you talked about this transition from PSA to research project.
I love that metaphor of being the off-stage to on-stage. That I think is a really, really useful metaphor. Anybody who's ever been in theater, who has ever been backstage behind a play, knows that there's a whole bunch of stuff that's going on back there that the people sitting in the audience is not seeing. They shouldn't be seeing it. Really, they should just be seeing what's happening on the stage. Now with the research project, we're exposing some of that. We're bringing that back out there. It's so useful.
So at the same time, I'm thinking then, as you say that, it's like, well, what is still going on behind the scenes? Because a great deal is still going on behind the scenes, and it's all of that, all of those acts of research that we undertake, because a lot happens that doesn't actually make an appearance on stage. It may not make its way into the project, or the blog post, or the article. But there's so much that happens to get to the point of that product, and a lot of that for the research project is going to be the research that people undertake. And so I'm wondering if the two of you might be able to talk a little bit about, as you think about that, or even some other sort of specific question, maybe talk a little bit about some serious, significant experiences that you've had as you've, say, undertaken a research project that might have helped you think differently about research, or if you want to sort of just address this kind of question about what kinds of research happen off stage or behind the scenes that you think are really integral to creating that successful project or successful play.
Yeah, I think for me, one of the most integral parts of sort of that distillation process is deciding what does or does not go into your project, what you decide to let influence your work. And one of the biggest things for me is we actually call it the CRAP test, the CRAAP test. And it stands for currency, relevance, authority, accuracy, and purpose. And you can kind of sit down with the source that you're looking at and decide whether it meets those criteria for your project. And for me, I think that that's one of the biggest things that's important when I'm trying to figure out whether something is good to pass along to somebody else. And sometimes we don't think of our work in that way. But when you're using a resource, that's really kind of a different way to think about it is that you're recommending that somebody else also look at this thing that you've chosen to look at and you've chosen to read and think about. And so for me, that's something that really changed in the way that I do research, is not thinking like, oh, is this true? Is this accurate? But thinking, is this something that I want somebody else to look at and read?
Mm-hmm. Can you say again what the terms are in that acronym? I got
Sure.
4 of them.
It's CRAP. It's currency, relevance, authority, accuracy, and purpose.
Accuracy. What's the second A?
Authority.
Authority.
I had not heard. Wasn't aware of that acronym. I think that really captures. So this is a librarian thing, right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Apparently.
Yeah. So that's really useful for me, because one of the things that is really important to me about those, I mean, they're all important, but the question of relevancy and purpose are important, because, Melissa, you sort of alluded to this when you said, you know, what am I asking myself about why I'm using a particular source? And I think a lot of times in my experience as a teacher and as a writer myself, I sometimes forget that the question shouldn't be just, is this a good source, as you said, or here's an expert that is often cited on this particular topic, but it's more specific, it's more focused on what is like, so this person is an expert, but is what this person is saying here relevant to the argument that I'm making, and does it somehow fulfill the purposes that I'm trying to fulfill? For example, some co-authors and I just submitted a piece for consideration in a journal, and when it came back, one of the reviewers had noted that we had made, and this is actually a paragraph that I had written, that in this one paragraph we had cited 7 different scholars on this particular topic. And I knew that what I was trying to do was kind of give a sort of literature review and background for this, but then when I saw that there were like 7 different people I had cited, I thought, what was my motivation for including those people at that particular point in that argument, and how is it fulfilling a particular purpose? So that reviewer's comments just pointing out how many people I had cited called to my attention and made me question why I was citing those particular resources or sources for that piece. And that was helpful. I may still elect to keep several of those, maybe 3 or 4 of them, but it did make me ask that question about relevance. Why am I citing these people here? Is it, like Scott, you were saying, is it to sort of bolster my ethos and to demonstrate that I know the scholarship and that I sort of know who I should be citing, which now, you know, is like not itself a legitimate single reason for doing that, but what relevancy and purpose does it have for the particular piece I'm writing and that particular section?
Yeah. I think that I go back to some early days in grad school when I was, you know, I had always done research in my writing, but I think I was approaching it in a really reductive way. In many ways, I was following a prompt that said, for example, you must cite 5 sources in your paper, and I was going out and finding the 5 sources that seemed to do exactly what I already wanted to do. And when I got into graduate school, it was a real eye-opener for me when my professor at the time, Doug Hesse, was talking about really picking apart the RE of research and the term search, and to thinking about these 2 terms separately, but also what their relationship was to one another, and that, you know, when I'm trying to find an argument or trying to convince an audience of something, I'm in search of something. I'm in search of the most effective means of trying to convince them of something. But I'm also searching myself. I'm also trying to figure out exactly what the argument is that I'm trying to make. And if I start to think about research as not only a search, but also a rethinking and a researching the questions that I originally started with, we start to see that research is about engaging with the sources that we are coming into contact with, and not only figuring out ways that they help support an argument, that they show how other people are thinking, but they really are changing the way that I've been searching. It's a research, the way I've been searching for a sense of what I'm hoping to say or what I'm hoping to argue to begin with. And so, you know, I mean, ultimately, because I do write in various forums that want to see something like a bibliography or a work cited, ultimately I get to that point. I have to cite my sources. The sources are there. I'm showing those sources for a variety of reasons. But until I get to that point, I really think of research in very different ways. I think about it as my own search and my own journey in trying to find an argument that I'm trying to make, and maybe going at it a little bit. Our former colleague Sidney South used to always say, "Go open," instead of going closed. To go open into that process of research and letting it become part of the discovery process for me.
And that can be particularly important if you're working with a subject that's very very narrow. You have a very particular thing that you want to talk about, and if you're struggling to find resources, kind of taking that open mindset is really important, just because there may not be a person who's written about that particular topic, you know, on that particular date in history for this particular subject, and so being able to pick through related sources and find the information that you need, and sort of create something of your own is really important, because, you know, there's an infinite amount, or a finite amount of information out there, and you're not going to be able to find particular pieces of information that you might need. So being able to go in with that sort of open mindset and gather what you need can be really important if you're working with something really specific too.
So I have been monitoring our social media feeds while y'all talk, and we have a question. It's actually from Chad. Who's wondering if we could talk a bit more about the relationship between research and revision. If someone wants to pick that up, the connection between research and revision.
Well, I don't. Go ahead.
Thing. I would say they're the same thing, but you go ahead.
You say that they were the same. Well, what I was going to say is I would maybe allude or refer us immediately back to what Scott just said about the and the searching, and that is, and you know, Scott, you didn't. I don't think you used the term recursive. But we often talk about the writing process as a recursive process, so rather than beginning with an idea or brainstorming and then drafting and revising, that always we're kind of working through the spiraling process of, as we write, we refine our ideas, and as those ideas are refined, we may refine our research topic, as Melissa was saying, or even the question that we're asking. And so for me, it becomes maybe that same thing happens, only it becomes more complicated with research. So, for example, I'll turn to myself again as an example. I have a long-time project where I'm researching the lives and the teaching practices of about 3 or 4 women at Hunter College in the late 19th century. It was then a women's teachers' college in the United States. And when I go in to do that research, I was very interested in looking at their classroom practices. But when I went into archives, when I was doing the research, and even when I was just reading about them, I would find these other really interesting questions, and I don't want to call them digressions necessarily, but these related topics that would draw my attention in a different direction from what I had intended. And oftentimes I resisted that because I wanted to stay kind of on the track that I'd set for myself. But ultimately what I did was sort of recognize the value of those digressions, of the moving in the different direction, but then what it required of me was a reframing of the question I was asking, because I became really interested in what the research was showing me. So it was recursive in the sense that I allowed the research that I found, the sources like that Melissa referred to, I allowed them to help me direct and redirect my thinking. Now, I think this is especially valuable to think about for those of you who are in our MOOC, because You're not writing to complete an assignment for a class, really. We're asking you in this project to write about something that you're invested in, that you've been doing research about, for a public audience that you want to somehow influence. So you aren't driven by any sort of set of requirements, like a certain number of sources to include. What you're really driven by, that purpose, right, that Melissa was talking about earlier. It's like, what is your purpose, and how are you going to marshal the evidence to persuade or to inform those individuals?
I think that I mean, we might all be saying exactly the same thing. You know, if I talked about that pulling apart of re and search, I would pull apart the terms re and vision, and revision means to re-see something. And how do I re-see something? I take a step back from it sometimes, and I let my gaze go maybe a little bit wider, and I see what else is there. And the other experiences I have, the other voices I hear, the other texts that I read, the other ways that people are talking back to me, they all become opportunities for me to re-see, to revise my thinking and ultimately my writing. And I think that especially what I love about this class, and something that I really do think about even in my courses at Ohio State, and that is opening up what I mean by research in terms of the kinds of sources. So I ask students to do this all the time. Take a step back. I don't always say to them, go back to the library or go back to this database and go deeper into that database. Oftentimes what I'd say to them is, take a step back and maybe re-see some things that weren't part of your gaze, part of your vision, because your lens was so focused, you had it so narrow that there was all kinds of, again, the offstage stuff, there's all kinds of stuff going on out there that you just weren't able to see. And so I think that this prefix of re, the idea of again, and opening yourself up, both in terms of revision and research, become really, really important to the process.
I'm not sure who said this, but I think it was maybe UK. I vaguely remembering something that one of my professors said when I was getting my master's degree, is that research is like teaching yourself. And so when you're doing your research, being able to keep an open mind is really important, like you said, Scott. I think, and if you think of it in the way that you're teaching yourself, you're going to want to be able to be open to a number of different ideas, a number of different things. You're not going to want to sit down and listen to one point of view or one perspective from one person. And I think that's maybe where the inclination to give as many sources on, on the same topic, that's where that comes from. And so I think that if you view research as a way to teach yourself, it kind of fits in with that idea of revision. Is that you're not going to want to sit there and you're not going to be satisfied with just the first thing that happens. And so revision and research kind of go hand in hand with that. You're not going to stop at the first resource that you find, because it may not be the best thing, just like you're not going to stop at the first draft of something that you've produced. You have to sit and kind of let those things mingle together and see kind of what comes out of them after you've taken a step back and looked at what you found there.
And I might also talk about this in a real practical sense, is that I wish I could say that I don't do this, but let's talk about procrastination. So it sounds to me like the way that Melissa and Kay and I are all talking about this idea of research and revision, we're talking about a process that takes time. Is that those things all of these processes and experiences we're talking about are simply not possible if you are only giving yourself a very short amount of time to actually work on a project. And so I think that even though this next project that's coming up has a set amount of time, you can see how the course itself is structured in such a way that these processes of having new experiences and coming into contact with new texts and writing in different forms and different formats, then one of the things that we're doing is modeling for you all of these different kinds of revision, research, invention processes that simply aren't possible if you have 3 days to work on a project. And so it's one of those, you know, I procrastinate, and so whenever I procrastinate, I always think, oh my gosh, if I had just started this a little bit earlier, I probably would have opened myself up to all kinds of possibilities. And I think that I think time is sometimes it's a luxury, but I think it's a necessity also.
And I think I also procrastinate. I'll admit, but I do want to say that I think a lot of the time when I think I'm procrastinating, what I'm really doing is sort of ruminating on what my ideas are. And I think something that is really important that I think sometimes people take for granted is being able to sit and have conversations or sit and thinking about your project. Those are both important parts of pre-writing that I think kind of get overlooked, and people say, oh, you know, I didn't actually start putting words on the page until the day before such and such was due. But really, if you spent, you know, those 5 days like really thinking about what you were going to write about and doing the research and talking with other people potentially about your project, I think all of those things definitely count. So sometimes I feel like I beat myself up a little bit for doing those things instead of writing, you know, so I'll do that.
You might also just be justifying procrastination.
Maybe, I don't know.
But I mean, I think what both of your comments, all kidding aside, Melissa, demonstrate is that we need also to recognize that both that researching and revising are more than just about putting words on the page. And different people have different processes. In all the years I've taught, you know, I think there are a lot of students who will say kind of what you've said, Melissa, which is a lot of the work, a lot of the really hard work that they do as writers and even as researchers is all it's all in their heads, right? I mean, and that they have to process before they put a lot on the page. And then there are other students who say, I have to get it on the page. I have to take very careful notes when I'm researching. And that's what sort of leverages my thinking and the kinds of conversations. And that's the metaphor I wanted to kind of pick up a little bit too, is this idea that the research that we're doing and the self-teaching that we're doing, which you also mentioned earlier, is also becoming familiar with the conversations that are underway about the topics that we're interested in. And I was kind of looking back at some of the topics folks have been investigating already in the MOOC, and you know, thinking about something like maintaining democratic freedoms, the relationship between empathy and violence and politics, gun violence and mental illness, the stigmas of mental illness and extremism in politics and political activism. And I think these are all probably topics that those individuals who are writing about those are intimately involved in. They're really paying attention to, sometimes, you know, outside of the actual specific work of this assignment. And that is all part of that process of research and of self-teaching. And I think, you know, it's valuable also not to discount what we know kind of from the context in which we find ourselves and the everyday conversations that we have with other people about our topics. Those are all sort of ways of engaging our topics, and even though it's not academic research, having conversations with folks and getting kind of the pulse that we feel about topics in our communities or in our countries is a valuable part of that as well.
Are we hearing any other questions, Paula? I'm not sure if you're hearing any other chatter out there.
No chatter has come in yet, but this all is so interesting. I've been tweeting some of the more relevant points, and hopefully that reaches some people too.
Cool. So, Melissa, I have a kind of a question for you, and it's as much out of my own curiosity, but I think it might be relevant here. Is that as you work with students at university libraries who are undertaking research projects, are there particular strategies or advice that you find yourself giving them frequently?
I think definitely kind of what I touched on earlier about being open is really important, just because I know it's very easy to kind of get honed in on one particular thing, and you say, I need to find the most perfect resource, and I need to find this particular ... And when you're trying to come up with something, not being able to find that perfect resource can be very frustrating. But being able to find something that is still relevant and still accurate, but isn't necessarily exactly what you needed, can sometimes be a real benefit, actually, because it allows you to find and make that space for your own voice, because you've stumbled on something that nobody else has written about. And so I think that that's something that's really, like I said, can be really beneficial to think about it sort of in that way, not get frustrated by, I can't find this particular resource about this one year in this one city in this one country. ... It's very easy to get frustrated like that, and I think it's important to just kind of stay open, like we said, and find the good, positive pieces of information that we can find in other kind of relevant resources. Answers your question or not?
Yeah, no, it does. I mean, as I said, it was mostly just partly a point of curiosity, because as an instructor, someone who gives assignments but isn't necessarily compelled to complete those assignments, I don't always know sort of what the process is or what challenges students might face or what practices they use that might serve as challenges or barriers to successfully researching. So yeah, it was helpful.
Yeah. A lot of the time too, it just depends upon what's available to them. So typically at universities, obviously, we're going to have large collections of books and access to databases and, just volumes and volumes of information. And that in itself can be overwhelming. But it's also really nice to have access to all those kinds of things. But if you're somebody who's not necessarily doesn't have access to those kinds of resources, isn't enrolled in a university, take a look at your public library. They frequently have access to databases as well. If you're in a country where you may not have access to a public library, the internet has obviously tons of information, tons of resources as well. But the more you go down towards those internet resources, the more you're going to have to employ that crap test that I was kind of talking about earlier. But that said, one thing I do also tell people very frequently is if they're looking at a topic that they don't know very much about, one of the best places to start is actually Wikipedia. Other librarians might not like me very much for saying that, but I think it's actually one of the best places to kind of get those creative juices flowing, learn a little bit on the surface of what your topic is, and that way you can scroll to the bottom of that page. There should be references there. You can take a look at those items, and that can be a really great jumping off point for the rest of your research. And it's free.
And it's free. So bouncing off of what you were just saying, Melissa, about using Wikipedia as a starting point, I'd like to respond to the question that Scott just threw up a second ago. He was asking about how social media can and how it can enhance research. And along with Wikipedia being a great starting point, I think social media, depending on how you employ it, can also be a great starting point. I know that there are fields of research that I know a little something about. I know what the journals are in those fields. I have a pretty good sense of the conversation. And sometimes when I'm going into a new field or a new area, it really helps to have a conversation with somebody who's already entrenched in that field. And that's where social media can come in. You can tweet at scholars who are a little bit further along and more professional in those fields. There are also Facebook groups of people who study the same stuff, and you can step in there and say, listen, here's some questions I'm asking in my research. What resources can y'all recommend? Now the flip side is sometimes you'll get a deluge of responses, and you'll need to employ the craft test to determine, is this something that I can actually incorporate into my work? Is this going to be useful or not? But I mean, social media and crowdsourcing, there's no shame in starting there and seeing what you can find. And then from there, if you find some resources, you can look at the bibliography or the works cited page of those resources to chase more rabbit trails. Go have conversations with librarians to see what else you can find to branch out from there. But yeah, it can definitely be a huge time saver to use your human resources in addition to your physical resources.
Yeah, when we were talking earlier about that idea or about procrastination, and Melissa said, you know, sometimes I like to think about this more as ruminating and talking to people, or maybe really just kind of sitting back and thinking. I mean, never before have we lived in a time that so many people are available to us so readily to have conversations when we're feeling a little stuck, or when we're lacking a resource, or when the world feels too big and we want people to kind of rein it in for us a little bit. You know, I'm always amazed at when I go to conferences or even meetings in the community how easy it is for somebody to create a hashtag, and somebody will just stand up in the audience and say, you know, as things come to mind, or if you know of resources, or if you know of other organizations, just send them to this hashtag. And that crowdsourcing sense of research, what a huge sense of community. And if you're feeling isolated as a writer or as a researcher, if you feel alone and you don't have any time you don't have anybody to have a conversation with, I mean, social media is, I mean, that's what it's intended to do. I mean, we're seeing all kinds of effects of the social media, but you know, it's one of the beautiful things about social media is how it brings us into contact with other people who have information that we don't have, who are struggling with the same questions that we have, people who are looking for people to collaborate with and they don't know where they are. And you know, when you think about social media in that way, I think we're living in a beautiful time right now when it comes to research and writing.
Absolutely. I think social media, like you said, has abundant positives. However, what you see on Facebook is not always true, so please, before you like anything or repost anything, employ that crab test on those images, make sure that data is true before you repost anything, please.
I feel like
From your local librarian.
There's the librarian.
Right, and I certainly would never, like, you're absolutely right, the idea of what's on Facebook, very cautious, using Facebook to get at what I want, beautiful. And I think, you know, Melissa, you know, you said about Wikipedia is also on my mind right now, because, you know, what's beautiful about Wikipedia is that the material there is written by the public for a public audience, which is exactly what this class is intended to do. And although there are things on Wikipedia that we should also be cautious about, you have a community of people who are constantly in conversation about the, you know, they're kind of doing the crap test to the Wikipedia entries themselves. They might not know that they're actually doing the acronym, but that's what they're doing. And you can see this on Wikipedia all the time. You open up a page and somebody has, the community has cited it for lacking some kind of citation, or it has not been researched, or it's not historicized properly. And that's the community who is keeping an eye on that subject matter and on that topic, who is, a lot of people say policing. I don't like that term so much. I think it's real collaboration and people, and the public sphere writing for the public sphere.
Definitely agree.
Melissa, I feel like you could turn the crap test into a meme that would just go viral. And if we could do that, Facebook would be a very different place.
Especially when we got to purpose. I think a large segment of my Facebook newsfeed would disappear.
Yeah, it's definitely. Go ahead.
No, go ahead, because I was going to make a sort of summarizing.
Go for it.
Okay, I was just going to say I was going to ask whether any of you had any additional comments or thoughts that you wanted to articulate now to kind of set out this week. But I was also just going to remind ourselves and everyone who's listening or who may be viewing later that we'll have a second installment of Office Hours next week. That also continues to take up the issue of research and researching and writing for public audiences. So this is just the first of two office hours really devoted to this topic. But then I'll open it back up to you all to see if you have any kind of final comments for this week.
I don't think I do. I think this has been really helpful, and I love the fact that the module is structured in such a way that we could have this conversation. If we're talking about research as a way of sometimes getting started or invention or discovery, I think this has been a really great conversation because in many ways that's where we are in the process of this paper or this assignment, is we're at the very beginning. And so I really do hope that next week some questions come in, some very specific questions about what the writers are finding and some of the struggles they're having and some of the breakthroughs that they've had, some of the successes. It'd be really great to hear some of that next week during the office hours.
Absolutely. And I just want to put myself out there and say if any of you have any specific questions, please post to the forums. I'll be checking all week. I'll be there to answer any of your questions, and I'll be there to throw my information and resources at you. So say hey.
Great. Well, thank you, Paula, for hosting us again. And everyone, we will see you again next week.
Okay. Bye, everybody.
Bye.
Bye.